Morning, ladies. Today we're going to introduce ecology, and we are going to do a basic introduction. So let's start with a simple question. So, what is ecology? According to Google, it's the branch of biology that deals with basically how living things deal with other things that are alive, or their physical surroundings. So, for example, think about like lions and how they deal with other lions and how they deal with hyenas and how they deal with their environment. Uh, that's the study of ecology. Now we can also relate this to viruses because currently we are undergoing a pandemic, so we will tie this into with viruses, and we'll do that towards the end. Because why are we doing this? Why study ecology? Well, we can study ecology because it helps us to understand living things. And for example, currently there's a bit of a coyote problem. Why is that the case? What is it that's allowing coyotes to explode and invade in certain areas where they normally don't? We can also apply the study of ecology to understanding coronavirus, other viruses that have caused major problems, for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years. Okay, but today what I want to show or talk to you about is, really basically the idea of what ecology I think of it like a game. Imagine like the question is, you probably heard this question: what's the purpose of life? What is the meaning of it all? Let's look at it from the perspective of a game. Okay, instead of it being life, it's just a game, and the idea of the game is you're trying to win, and maybe by trying to win, you're trying to make as much money as possible. Okay, and here's the thing: there's many ways to make money. So there's many ways to play this game. The idea is, in this case, we're not trying to make money. We are just trying to pass on something called DNA or your genetics, basically. So, for example, in this picture here, we have a black widow spider. Okay, female is the large black widow spider. The male is the little tiny, puny little thing, top right corner. Now, the game is, in this case, we're not talking about making money. The game is to pass on genetics. So, if he wants to win the game, he's going to have to approach the scary female. Now, uh, this game has consequences. Sometimes what happens is the males get eaten. But if he doesn't play the game, then he will definitely lose. So as we go through this and we start talking about ecology, which I think of it as a game, you're going to see that there's multiple ways of playing this game, and there's not one way that works best for everything. So we said the goal of this is to pass on your DNA, genetic information. And when you think about the current pandemic, COVID-19, goal of the virus, you know, obviously not our goal, but the goal of the virus is to get as many copies of its genetic material out there as possible. That's its goal. That's the goal of anything. Now, viruses, a little piece of information, they're not considered to be alive because, if you remember from elementary school, all living things are made of cells, and viruses are not made of cells. So they're not considered to be living, but they do a lot of things that living things do. Like, for example, they reproduce and they mutate. Um, so just like living things, their goal is to get as many copies of their genetic information into the next generation. And there are different ways to do this. Um, but here's the thing, one thing that you have to do to be able to play this game, to get copies of your genetics into the next generation, is you're going to try to have to survive. That's the first goal. Because if you ain't alive, it's very hard to pass on your DNA. So here's the question: why or how do baby turtles know to head for the water after birth? Here's another question: why do baby Komodos roll around in feces? Oh boy, in their own poop, or even someone else's poop. In both cases, actually, sorry, the first question is a different question. It's how do they know to head for the water? Okay, they know because it's actually programmed in their DNA, in their genetics. And the idea behind that is that programming is going to try to increase their survival rate because the first goal like I said, in passing on your genetics, the first goal should be to live. Because if you don't live, you can't pass on your genetics. So the baby Komodos, uh, they run the risk of being eaten by bigger Komodos. So in their DNA, they have been programmed to do things like roll around in feces, crap, so that they avoid being eaten by larger, scary Komodos. Again, first thing you have to do is to survive. So why a wise sage once said, very hard to reproduce when you're dead. It's very, very true. These behaviors that we just talked about with the baby turtles and the Komodos, those behaviors are meant to increase the chance of survival so that they can grow up and they have a chance then to pass on your DNA. Because again, the goal of this, if you think of it as a game, is to pass on your DNA. But the first step is to make sure that you survive long enough to be able to do this. Now, when you're thinking about this as a game, there are, games have strategies. So when we look at living things and how they reproduce, here's a question. What strategy is better? Is it better to make copies of yourself? Or is it better to reproduce sexually, which means with a partner? Now, on the left is a picture of a water fleet, something called a Daphnia. And if you see these little round things in the back of the Daphnia, these little things here, you can see them. There's one, there's two. Those are babies. They're actual clones of the, in this case, female. Daphnias are primarily female-dominated society, just like St. Joe's. And what a Daphnia does is when it reproduces what's called asexually, so it's not sexually, it's asexually, and it makes copies of itself. Whereas if you look on the right, I think this is Justin Bieber, I believe. Humans, like mammals, like most reptiles can reproduce asexually, but most of the time it is sexual reproduction. You need a mate. What's the better strategy? Well, one thing you'll learn is that really there is no best strategy. It's what works well for the organism. So there's advantages to both. A clone gets to pass on all of its DNA because it doesn't share any of its DNA with a partner. So the Daphnia here in this picture gets to pass on all of its DNA to its babies. And remember, the goal of the game here is to get as many copies of your DNA into the next generation. So when you reproduce sexually with a partner, you're only passing on half of your DNA. So from the point of view of the game, that's a bit of a cost. So, however, if we do see organisms that are reproducing sexually, there must be some sort of an advantage to this because otherwise all organisms would reproduce asexually, right? Because you would get a chance to pass on all of your DNA. So here's a simple question. How many offspring does a sexually reproducing organism have to pass on so that they pass on as much DNA compared to an asexually reproducing organism that reproduces through cloning? 2, right? Because if you pass on half as much DNA sexually, then if you pass on or create 2 times as many offspring, that would be as much DNA as something that reproduces through cloning. Now, so sounds like asexual reproduction is better, but if we do see sexual reproduction in the natural world, humans, primates in general, mammals, birds, then obviously sexual reproduction must be good. There must be an advantage to reproducing sexually. Now, major advantage is in the fight against disease, like, for example, something like the coronavirus that we're experiencing right now. The advantage of sexual reproduction is that you're not passing on all of the DNA, which means that the babies that you're making are not exact copies. So there are differences with the babies. And the advantage of having babies that are different is that if there is some sort of like a viral outbreak, like we're experiencing right now, the fact that not all babies are the same or all offspring are the same means that some will have resistance to this outbreak. Um, so sexual reproduction produces variety. And that variety is actually a weapon that guards against things like disease. Whereas if everyone was exactly the same, like for example with asexual reproduction, imagine the virus was able to infect an individual, but every individual was exactly the same. Well, then theoretically, that virus would be able to affect all individuals and therefore would be a big problem for that population. So the advantage then of sexual reproduction is it generates this variety that does protect us against disease. But as I said, the disadvantage is you're only passing on half your DNA. There is another disadvantage too. You do have to find a mate, and sometimes it's there's a lot of competition for mates. Like for example, um, male lions, often have to fight other male lions for access to females. Male gorillas have to do the same thing. We talked about, for example, the risk that the little male spider has to undertake to, get together with the large and angry, I'm throwing the word angry there, black widow spider. So there are risks to mating, of course. But again, the answer is which one's better? They're both good. They both have their advantages and they both have their disadvantages. Here's another question. Is it better to live in groups or is it better to live individually? When we're playing this game of life, what's better? Well, here we have on the bottom bees, on the top ants. Now they're both social organisms. You do have a case study on bees versus ants. There's a lot of similarity between them. There's also some differences, and they live obviously in groups. Now, these are organisms that live individually. What do you see in the natural world? We see both, examples of both, right? So obviously, both strategies work. They have their advantages and disadvantages. Now here, I'm not going to play these links for you. You could play them yourself. But cheetahs versus a wild dog. So wild dogs hunt in groups. Cheetahs generally work by themselves. Okay, so what's the better strategy? Well, here's the thing. If you're working in groups, the advantage is it's easier to find things, right? You can work together to find prey. The disadvantage, though, is when you do catch something, you got a lot more mouths to feed. The flip side, if you're working individually, is harder to catch prey. That's the disadvantage. But the advantage is if you do catch something, hey, you got it all to yourself, assuming nothing comes around to steal it. I'll give you another question. Again, we're thinking about ecology as a game. The game is to pass on as much DNA as possible. Is it better to be bigger or smaller? Is it better to reproduce slowly or quickly? So on the left is a blue whale. On the right is bacteria. So the blue whale is the biggest animal ever, even bigger than dinosaurs. Over 100 feet tall, 100 feet tall, yeah, about 100 feet long, 300,000 pounds. Wow, it's big. Takes about 5 to 10 years to reach sexual maturity. Takes, over a year to have a baby, and it breeds every 2 to 3 years. A female does. Whereas if you compare it to bacteria, bacteria are so small you need a microscope to see them. They can start reproducing as quickly as 20 minutes. Of course, they reproduce through cloning, whereas blue whale reproduces sexually. What's better? Now, you should kind of start to see a pattern. There really is no better or worse. There are, they're both good. They both work because we both, see examples of really small things and we see examples of very big things. Now, what's the advantage of, being big? Well, the advantage of being big is, there are less things out there that can take you down. If you're smaller, you have to worry about more things being able to eat you. But if you're bigger, you have to eat more. You need more food. If you're smaller, you don't need as much food. Uh, you know, so you're going to have advantages and disadvantages to both. Reproducing slowly versus quickly. Uh, the organs that reproduce more slowly are generally sexually reproducing organisms, whereas the ones that reproduce very quickly often are, not always, because insects reproduce quickly and they generally reproduce sexually. But the advantage of reproducing slowly is that the offspring are probably going to be taken better care of, because if you're reproducing slowly, you're most likely going to be parenting and taking care of the offspring. Whereas things that generally reproduce quickly generally don't parent. Generally, the offspring are left to fend for themselves and therefore less likely to survive. So here's the point. And I think you should probably get the point by now is that there is no ideal strategy. There are many strategies. Each strategy is going to have its benefits. Each strategy is going to have its drawbacks. But the fact that you see each strategy or different types of strategy in nature tells you that there are many ways to be successful. So let's talk about something that's even smaller than bacteria, viruses. In fact, we're going to look at 3 examples of deadly viruses. And why study viruses? Well, there's a whole thing called viral ecology, which is the study of viruses and how they interact with living things and how they interact with the environment. Why would you want to study this? Because if you understand things and how they interact with other things and the environment, then you can understand, for example, if you have a population problem, we talked about with the coyotes, if you have a population's out of control, you can try to figure out why, or in this case, for viruses, you're going to try, if you understand how they interact with other things and how they interact with the environment, you could use that information to be able to stop viral outbreaks. Information is powerful. So let's look at 3 examples of deadly virus. Smallpox, caused by variola major and variola minor, major being the more lethal one, mortality rate up to 30% in the last century, 20th century, so before you were born, most likely. 300 million people died of smallpox. Now, this virus is only found in humans. It originated in animals, at some point migrated into humans, and then evolved to become only human specific, so only living in humans. Now, what's interesting about this virus is that you were asked to look at a video clip about this, but it was a major effort taken by the WHO to get rid of this disease. And what they did was they tried to vaccinate as many individuals as possible. And here in this picture, so on the top right is an individual with smallpox. We can see the physical signs of smallpox. The bottom right is the actual smallpox virus. The little girl in the black and white photo, that's actually the last female, the last person to have smallpox. The last case being 1977. So the WHO set out on this mission to eradicate smallpox using vaccination program. And in 1980, they declared the world free of smallpox. Major victory. Think about this. 300 million people died in the 20th century. Like, that's crazy. That is like killing the population in Canada 9 times over. or almost killing the entire population of the US. Now, obviously, this was a virus that had to be dealt with because of the sheer numbers of individuals that were killed by this virus. But why was it so bad? Like, why was it so hard to control? Well, a couple of things. One is the incubation period was up to 12 days. And that should ring a bell because the current coronavirus, COVID-19, has an incubation period of about maybe 14 days or even longer in some cases. Now, there are a few ways you can get smallpox. One major way was through the air, airborne, right? And if you were within 6 feet of an individual who was infected with smallpox, you were at high risk of contracting it. Again, that should sound familiar because the current strategy is to stay 6 feet or about 2 meters apart from each other. Again, because if you understand how viruses work, the ecology of it, then you can use that information to deal with these things. But what's interesting about smallpox is that, unlike COVID-19, the virus can remain infectious. Now, we don't want to use the word alive. You often hear that in the media. The virus can remain alive. The virus is not alive to begin with. So let's say this: the virus can remain infectious. So what that means is that if a virus is outside the body and it's on the surface, okay? If it's infectious, that means that if you touch that surface and then you expose yourself to it, you can get the virus and make you sick. If it's not infectious, that means that it's been on that surface for so long that the virus basically can't make you sick anymore. Okay, so you hear like in the media that COVID-19 on certain surfaces can last maybe a few hours to a few days, and there's a whole protocol now. When you bring stuff home, you should sanitize it, this and that. Okay, smallpox, under certain conditions, can remain infectious for years outside the body. So now we're trying to get a picture of why this disease was very hard to deal with. One is the incubation period is 12 days. So you didn't even know you were sick and you're spreading this thing around. The other thing is that this virus can stay outside the body for a long time. So people could touch things that were contaminated and get sick. So it was you can see these characteristics made the virus very successful and very easy to spread. Now, let's compare it to another virus. Let's look at the Spanish flu. Okay, Spanish flu was a devastating flu, type of influenza. There's different types of influenza. Spanish flu is just one example of a really bad outbreak that lasted about 3 years, 1918 to 1920. 500 million people possibly affected, possibly 50 million deaths. That's like 10% mortality rate. Now, this virus, this outbreak, occurred toward the end of World War One. So World War One set up the conditions, the perfect conditions for an outbreak. Think about this. You have a war going on, right? People are not going to probably get as much food as they normally would. So they'd be malnourished, lots of injuries, lots of close contact, soldiers moving around. Hospitals and camps are going to be overcrowded, right? And how do viruses spread? Well, close contact is a key thing to allowing viruses to spread. Now, in the middle, you see a picture of basically a hospital with a lot of individuals that are sick. You see how close by they are, overcrowded, because again, this is wartime. This is not a good time to be getting the influenza virus. Top right corner is the actual virus itself. What's interesting is about the graph is that normally you think about flu as the really young and the very old being vulnerable, but on the y-axis is the death rate and the x-axis is the age. You notice is actually that there's a bit of a peak in the middle. So what was interesting about the 1918 Spanish flu is actually a lot of young individuals were hit hard by it because sometimes the virus actually isn't really the problem. It's actually your immune system and how it overreacts to the virus. And because young people, people between the ages of like 20 to 40, have very, very strong immune systems. They can also have very, very strong reactions. And sometimes the problem is the immune system overreacts too much, and the individual suffers not because of the virus, but because of how much the immune system overreacts to the virus. Which is an interesting piece of information. So, so the Spanish flu was really, really bad. It's obviously not the only flu outbreak. We had the Asian flu killing about 1 to 4 million. The Hong Kong flu killed about 1 million. Um, the swine flu, H1N1 2009, that killed about 280,000. Typical seasonal flu kills between 280 to 650,000. The Russian flu, I tried looking it up. There wasn't really a whole lot of information on that, but I did come across something that was very interesting. Apparently, people over the age of 50 were, for the most part, immune to this virus because they had seen probably a virus similar to this when they were younger. So when your body sees a virus, it builds immunity to it. And if it happens to encounter in the future a virus that looks, I guess, very, very similar to that previous virus, then you already have immunity to it. And I guess the Russian flu is an example of that. Now, here's the thing about influenza. So unlike the smallpox virus, this is found in not only humans, but in other animals like birds and pigs, especially birds and pigs. So why would it be really hard then, or almost impossible, to eliminate the influenza outbreaks? Well, in smallpox, the difference is the virus is only in humans, right? So if all humans are immune, the virus has nowhere to go and eventually will disappear. But how are you going to how are you going to immunize or vaccinate all individuals and animals to prevent outbreaks of influenza? You can't do that. So even if all humans are immunized, there's going to be other influenza viruses coming out of animals into the human population that's going to cause new outbreaks. Therefore, it would be impossible to eliminate these influenza outbreaks. One final note on the right actually is an interesting poster. I got this from Wikipedia and talking about the Spanish flu. By the way, it's called the Spanish flu, but I don't think actually originated in Spain. That's another interesting tidbit of information. And talking about, a little bit about the disease and what to do and kind of blurry. Also, how to make a mask, and it's kind of cool. I want to show you that. So, lastly, then, COVID-19. So, um, like the other two viruses, it's a non human origin. Remember, smallpox was human specific, but it did originate in some other organism. And influenza actually does come from other animals into the human population. I believe COVID-19 started off in bats. I believe that's the main hypothesis. Now, um, I guess the mortality rate so far, if you look at the data as of today, about 35 out of 738,000 individuals have passed away from COVID-19. So the mortality rate there is less than 5%. So lower than the Spanish flu, and lower than smallpox, but still quite significant. The incubation period is about 2 to 14 days, maybe even 27. The average is about 5. So if we compare that to the previous two examples, you can see that the incubation period is kind of like smallpox, quite lengthy, therefore making it hard to kind of stop the spread in the sense that people could be not sick, or not showing signs and spreading disease like they did in smallpox. Whereas if you remember influenza, the incubation period is quite fast. So, if you remember the question before, is it better to reproduce quickly or slowly? The advantage of a slower reproduction rate, I guess you can think of it this way, is that the virus remains hidden better over time. You can infect more individuals. It's harder than to stop that. Um, Now, here's the other thing. Similar to influenza, the virus can stay outside the body for a few hours to a few days. That's similar to influenza. So it has the incubation period of like smallpox, but it's not as resilient outside the body as smallpox is. Um, Okay, so will we ever see future coronavirus infections? Yeah, definitely. Because first off, this is not the first one. We've had SARS 2003, and we had MERS. I can't remember when MERS was. It was 2013 or 14. Can't remember now. So because these are non-human origins, unfortunately, even if we do come up with a vaccine, you ain't seeing the end of them. So that is the end of my intro to ecology. Thanks for listening.